Hey Ben, Tommy here. Thanks for your work in week one. Want to send you a video reply to say hello a little more directly and give you some feedback on what you've written in both response forums, which is excellent, by the way. So I want to just highlight some stuff that I think will serve you well as kind of emphases going forward. They'll be generative as we get deeper into Matthew. Hope you're hanging in there, by the way. I imagine your work has been complicated or intensified by the fires, and so we'll see what lies ahead here in the coming weeks and months. Okay, first of all, I think I wanted to highlight what you say about the kind of dramatic tensions that characterize Israel's life. They're called to obey God, and in some ways, they are the people who don't forget the name, the memory of their God on the earth. And yet they are who they are. What makes that memory possible is this sort of unrelenting faithfulness of this God to them, even when they're unfaithful to God. And so there's this underlying promise that sort of holds Israel together and is unconditional, even as they face all kinds of consequences for being disobedient to God's law, growing idolatrous, entering into problematic alliances with other peoples and kingdoms. Those consequences shape Israel. They sort of hurt all kinds of people in Israel, and yet God doesn't sort of immediately disinherit them or define them as no longer Israel in some like juridical and abstract sense. They remain the people in whom God's memory is alive across the generations, even as they suffer the consequences of their sin. So that I think is key to who Israel is, as you say, the children of promise. And yet people that follow God's ways in certain senses. What else did I want to say about this first response forum? Oh, David, and we'll get to this too in the genealogy, but yeah, it's hard to pull together all the different strands that I asked you to think about, and don't feel obligated to figure that out all the time when I ask you very open-ended and broad questions like this. You've got some great starts with what you've written. But David, as you say, is remembered as a celebrated king, faithful to Israel's God in all kinds of decisive ways, and yet also deeply unfaithful in shameful ways that are remembered somewhat unflinchingly in the Deuteronomistic history, also in the by the chronicler. So this David sort of embodies, I think, what you go on to also discuss, which is the moral ambiguity of the institution of kingdom itself, of monarchy as a structure of rule. It's both a refusal of God's kingdom in First Samuel, as you say, and nevertheless this institution, this intergenerational structure that God does inhabit in a certain sense. And David already subverts that institution in some ways. And I would say Jesus subverts that monarchic institution sort of to a maximum degree. And we'll have to sort of explore how that unfolds in Matthew. The legacy of David, I think, in Matthew is complicated, not straightforward, and deserves kind of careful attention for when David's name comes up in the narrative. Um, all right, good with the who is Israel question. The genealogy, lots of good stuff in your response here. And I'm glad that you kind of mentioned this particular character of Jeconiah, the key role that he plays in the Babylonian destruction and um, the aftermath of that, and the curse that hangs over his line, as it were. But you sort of acknowledge, I think rightly, that this genealogy is not really concerned to retrace what we would think of today as a genetic line. Uh, Jesus is not the son of Joseph genetically, obviously, at the end of the genealogy. And I would say you're correct that the Davidic dynasty could be transmitted, the authority of David's name and body, by adoption, but possibly, as you also say, by his brothers, the brothers of Jeconiah, I mean. So, what I'm trying to get at here is that I think you're right that at the end of the day, people's bodies matter. The way one body grows out of others matters. But to think about bodies as genetics is, to my mind, a kind of relatively recent abstraction. Whatever genes are present, they're always present with all kinds of other things. And you can't ever sort of reduce the life of a person, of a string of people, simply to the genetics that are transmitted across those generations. So bodies matter, but there's always more to the bodies involved. And I think that that is something to be borne in mind as we sort of make sense of Israel's memory, the memory of the kingdom, etc. So more we could say there. I keep thinking of this line in some episode of the Game of Thrones, and I can't remember exactly which episode it comes from. It comes from the king of, I don't know if you're familiar with Game of Thrones, hopefully you are, of the ship um part of that's the ship kingdom, the one that controls kind of the seas and the ship industry, a guy with really long dreads. He's great. And he says at this key juncture, history does not remember blood, it remembers names. And I think that's a good kind of comment on what we have here. And it's not that blood is insignificant, it's that blood is indeterminate in terms of who we're talking about and how their lives came to be the way that they are. And that sort of more robust bodily presentation of the human intergenerationally is, I think, what characterizes the memory evoked by the genealogy. More we can talk about there. You asked a question at the end: can we break Matthew into three parts corresponding to the three periods in the genealogy? I don't know. That's a great question. I'm not sure I can think of natural divisions in the narrative that would be neatly threefold, or leave the narrative neatly threefold. We can keep talking about that. One other thing, you talk about, I think, the primacy of the exile in this genealogy. And I think that's a really astute observation. And I think you say at the beginning, even though Ezra and Nehemiah tell the story of Israel returning from exile, this genealogy suggests in some ways they have not really returned. And I think that that is on the right track. And there's been a lot of debate about this in New Testament scholarship. My sense is that exile as a kind of governing term is important but inadequate, because exile is one key feature of a whole series of curses that befall Israel as a consequence of its kind of protracted disobedience to God's law. And so, while there might be some geographic restoration of part of the Jewish community to the land, whatever we're going to say about their conditions vis-a-vis exile, they are, as you're implying, still enduring the curses that God's law prescribes. And those curses involve disease to their bodies. They involve estrangement between human beings and land. They involve issues of fertility, infertility, foreign domination. And we find these curses clearly still characterizing the generation of Israel that Jesus comes to in the land, just a fraction of the people, of course, which are sprawled around the world still. And that, I think, is a good way of making sense of what Jesus is born into, what he faces, and what his life is addressing by how it unfolds concretely across the span of the narrative. So we'll come back to that, but I think you've hit on something that gets at the epic scope of who Jesus is according to Matthew. So good work and great to be in conversation with you. Looking forward to more conversation in the weeks ahead, and hope you're staying safe and not too harried with what's going on in LA.